The next section that we're going to build is the members section. And there's going to be two cool things that we're going to cover here. Number one, we're going to start working with grids. We didn't really cover grids so far, and this is a good opportunity to get started. The second thing is that we have here this members only responsive type that takes up the whole screen. So it's going to change its size if the screen is changing. And also we're going to use the variable, because it's a variable form, we're going to create kind of like a scrolling animation where the text gets bolder as we're scrolling in, and it's going to move up, kind of like a text parallax effect. So that's going to be cool. All right, let's talk about this section here, how we're going to build this. And by the way, this is CMS content, right? Because it's talking about maybe the most recent event here. So this whole section is a CMS section, pulling in one element and the data from one element. Now, a question would be, how should we structure this thing, right? So if I'm just marking up this area here to see what kind of areas we have here. So we have this area here at the top, right, which is centered and has this bottom border here. We also have this button here, which takes up this whole space and has the border on the top. And then we basically have maybe 4 different groups here. We've got this as a group, we've got the other one as a group, and then the 2 below. So basically we have, and I'm calling them groups because they're going to be, each of them is going to be wrapped in a div to organize how it looks. Now, so far, to organizing our divs together, we've been excessively using Flex, which is amazing. However, if we're going to use Flex to organize these elements and organize them vertically, then I'm going to have to basically wrap, create another wrapper here for this line, so that inside of this line they're going to be stacked horizontally and aligning left and right and something like this. So that's going to add basically another 2 divs, and that's a lot of divs to organize here. And so in this case, organizing this whole thing as a grid is going to be actually more simple. So let's dive in and start doing this, and we'll talk about the actual grid and also Webflow's quick stack, which is kind of like a simplified grid that they've created. So let's dive into the project and continue from where we left off. And of course, you can continue from where we left off in the clonable below. At this point, we don't really need this temp section anymore, so I can get rid of it. And let's just go ahead after the recent event section. Let me, in the page wrapper, add another section here, which I'm going to call members section. Okay, what do we have in this members section? First of all, it's taking up the whole screen. So I should probably define it as 100% viewport height, not percent, just viewport height, and give it some kind of a background so we don't see the video that we have in the background. Okay, so now we have a full-on section here. Now, this full-on section has a background image, and as I said, the background and all of the content here is going to come from the CMS so that it's dynamic. So let's go ahead and bring in a collection item inside of this member section. Let's bring a collection list. Actually, we can't bring collection item. Now, I want to pull in an event, so I'm going to pull in from the event. And as we've previously seen, there's a lot of events here. So let's go here and just limit it to just one item. So now we're only bringing one item, and I can filter this. Let's also do the most recent event. I know that we're seeing it here at the top, but we can do something else if we want, by event organizer or by location. I don't know. I'm just going to, for the sake of it, maybe not even filter it. So I'm just going to have one element, and it's going to be random. Let's start to work with that. So the first thing I want is for the image, the item inside, to take up the whole screen and have a background image. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's, inside the collection wrapper, inside the collection list, the collection item, let's call this member, let's call this feature event, I guess, featured event, and make sure that this takes up 100% viewport height. And we're going to give it a background image that is pulling from the CMS, the thumb. And we're going to go here and set this up so that it's centered, right? So how do we do this? We'll go into the background, add an image, and make sure that we have cover. We have this in the center. So something like this. Okay, so we already have a background image here. This looks pretty good. Okay, so we've got the first step, which is to bring the image. Now we want to create this card effect on top of it. So let's make sure that, let's bring in some div inside to have it as a card. And we can call this div, let's call this card, because white card. We might use that later on in logins and stuff like that. So white card, I want to make sure that it's centered. So the member featured event, let's turn that into a flex and make sure that it's aligning stuff to the center. And now I can see the white card in here. Let's give it a bunch of padding. Let's give it a white background, and probably also kind of like a drop shadow or something like this. Drop shadow, box shadow. Yep, add that. Size play around with blur a little bit. Let's see how that looks. Okay, we'll keep playing with that as we have content, and we'll see if this looks good or not. Now, we're going to bring in content inside. I wonder if we need to give this kind of like a fixed width, but let's get started and see how it goes. So we've mentioned we want to bring inside a grid, because I can have a grid with two columns, because I have here column left, column right, and I can have the cells at the top spanning these two grid items. So in general, there's basically, there used to be just one element, and you can see it here, that's called grid. Now, recently, Webflow introduced this quick stack to make things easier. And I want to actually get started with the grid so that you understand the more powerful way of doing things. Then I'll explain to you what's the point of quick stack. So let's get started by dropping in a grid. It automatically suggests, two columns, which is good for me. I actually need 3 rows, although it doesn't really matter because the rows are going to be there automatically. Now that we've got the actual setup, how do we bring in the content? I'm going to click done here. Basically, intuitively, a lot of people would come in and drop an element into the grid itself. And I'm just going to go ahead to show you what happens if you do this. So you drag in an element, and you can see that the element, let's get the name of the event from here. So I've got an element right now, the text element, and I also want to bring in the sport, right? So let's copy and paste this element. And now you can see that the next element, which we want to be the sport name, is actually getting another cell. But I want them to be together in the same cell, and I can't seem to do that. And the reason is that basically every cell in the grid can only have one element. So basically what I would need to do is bring in a div inside of this grid, and then put both of these text elements inside the grid. It's actually not even possible by dragging here, so I can just drag them both into this div element. Okay, so now a grid cell only has one element, which is this div that holds these two text blocks together. Now, as you can see, this might be annoying because you bring in a grid and then you have to bring in a div block for each one of these elements. So I'm just going to delete this for a second to show you how the quick stack works. Basically, a quick stack is a simplified grid, and if I bring that in, originally it looks the same, right? Like two columns and maybe 3 rows, so it kind of looks the same. However, if I'm going to drag in an element here, like a text block, to this cell, let's get the name. Basically, Webflow automatically created cells here, which basically replace the grids that I would need to bring on my own. So now I can go ahead and add another text block into this cell, and then I have 2 of them. This is the sport name automatically. So it basically created the divs for me, and it's kind of like a time saver. So you might want to use that. I prefer usually not to use that just because it's kind of like a element that is more simplified. That means you don't have the full controls that you have on the grid. Also, you might see here from the layout panel, we can't turn this grid into something else. So when we're using a normal grid, and let's revert to a normal grid here, it's basically just a normal display setting, right? So I have a grid, and you can see here that it's just the layout of a grid. And I can later turn it into a Flexbox or something else if I want to in a different breakpoint. So it's much more versatile, and I would rather work with just normal grids. So let's go ahead and actually start doing what we need to do. And let's bring in the divs. So the first div that we need, and I'm just going to hit, div block. Actually, let's give this grid a class. So let's rename this. Let's call this featured event grid. Okay. And then we have the first div block, and you can see that I can go ahead and make sure that this first div block is spanning the 2 columns, and that's pretty cool. That's how you can create pretty cool and complex layouts using the grid. I'm going to copy another one. This second div block, we want this to be here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And actually, we need another one because that's the actual layout that we have. We've got a design that spans 2 columns here, 2 columns here, and here we've basically got 4 elements. Okay, so now we have basically the structure. And I can call this, basically, maybe I don't even need to name this div block yet. Let's start bringing in the content. So I'm bringing in a text block. Actually, maybe the women's final need to be an H3 element or H2. Do we have something here? Yeah, heading 3, and we'll give it the event name. Okay, so let's use H3 because it is a section heading in this case. We're going to get the name from the event name. Let's give it a class of event name. Okay. Oh, but event name in general, it's usually white. That's why I think we created text color black, which I'm going to apply to this. So this is great. Let's add another text block, normal text block to this div, the top div. Let's put it at the top. And this one, we want this to be sport name. So this is sport name, and we also have sport name, sport type as a class that we created. So that looks good. So actually, I can see here that maybe the gray is not strong enough. Maybe we actually need another darker gray, because on black, it's good. If I'm going to change the global gray, and that's not even the global gray, but if I'm going to change the global gray into a darker one, it's not going to have enough contrast, I guess, on the black part. So let me add another, let's go to the style guide and add another text color. I'm going to duplicate this. And instead of text color white, let's duplicate this to text color dark gray. And let's select the gray here. Let's go to the page and see how that looks. So I can apply a combo class of text color dark gray. It's a tiny bit darker, but let me go ahead and make this a little darker. Okay, so this looks good. This looks good. The event name also has a 20 pixels at the top, which is creating actually too much space, I think. Too much space. So I want to edit the event name, not the, if I'm going to change the padding right now, the margin top, as you can see, it's actually going to apply the change to text color black, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to go back to the event name from the selector and just make sure that I'm changing this one here. Something like this, like 7. Okay, back. Now the spacing is better. Now I want to center these two elements. So let's select the div. Let's actually call this center, or maybe text center, and change the text centering here to center. Okay, that's great. So now we have a class that can just center text. That looks good. Let's bring in the content here. So we have date and hour. That's just the static normal text. So in this div block, let's add a text element, text block. Paste in this. I'm going to give this dark gray, the text color dark gray, so that it's more readable. And I'm going to bring in another text element, text element. This one is going to be dynamically the date. And this, I'm going to make this black. So let's do black, text color black. Okay, that looks good. They should probably be spaced out. Okay, I want to add a little bit of spacing between them and also more spacing at the bottom. Let's go ahead and actually copy this div block a few more times so we already have content in place, and then we can style them correctly. So one, actually let's call this grid content and copy paste this a few times. Okay, no, not inside of this featured grid 2. Let's select the grid content and move it. We want this to be, well, it's kind of like weird to drag things within a grid, but we want to drag it to the right place. Okay. Overall, not bad. These two obviously need to be aligned to the right. So we're going to add a combo class. But first, for this grid content, I want to manage the spacing. So let me turn this into a flex box, not horizontal, but vertical, just so I can add a little bit of a gap, not in the columns, sorry, but between the rows. Okay. So that's great. I've got 4 pixels of space between them, and then a little bit of space, bottom margin, just so we have space between the rows. Okay, this looks good. Now these 2 rows of grid content need to be right aligned. So let's do here text align right, and set the text align to be right on this. And then we can select this grid content and text align right. Okay, so this looks good. This heading doesn't have the dotted line, so let's fix that. Oh, we actually only have text center here. So let's give this a class before the text center to manage the bottom border. So I'm going to call this featured events header, which is going to have border. And you can see here we've got like dashed border, only not on the top, not on the right, just on the bottom. Bottom, yes, no, 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 okay. That looks good. And after that, we can add the text center. Text center. Fantastic. Let's see how that looks. We need a little bit more spacing. Also spacing between the text and the padding, as this text and the border. So that's going to be an additional padding. Again, not on the text center, but on the featured event header. So a little bit more padding here, and margin, so we have more. Maybe not margin. Maybe this looks okay. Let's see if I can change the dashed thing. Featured Can we change the dash? It's just dashed. And this is dotted. I guess I can. I was wondering if I can change how spaced they are. But okay, let's keep it this way. So this looks good. I'm thinking whether I want to make sure that the card is not too big. That this white card, for example, has maximum width of maybe 350 or 400. Yeah, I actually think this is better. So even if the title is long, this white card cannot be more than 400 pixels wide, and I think this is great. Okay, this is the last div block, which should have a button. But first, let me give this a class and call this featured event. Let's call this call to action, CTA, so that we have a little bit of padding at the top and also a top dash border at the top, not at the bottom, at the top. Now let's bring in a button. So we want to bring in the main button. Let's bring this inside here. Okay. So this button looks okay, but I wonder why the text is not centered. Maybe we never had a button that takes up the whole space. So let's go ahead and edit this component just to make sure that, you see, the button is justifying to the left. We want this to justify to the center. Okay. Now out of the component, just make sure that I can change the text button to what? Members zone. Members zone. And I'm going to connect it to the page when we're going to have the page later on. Okay, let's preview this. Okay, I think overall the card looks pretty good. And we've used a grid. And that wasn't too difficult, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and do the heading that we have in the background. So for the title, first of all, it needs to be responsive. The size of the text itself needs to be responsive, but also it's in the background, and we want this to go behind, scroll kind of like behind the text as we're kind of like scrolling. So we're going to have to set this as an absolute to go behind the card and to take up the whole space. Let's see how we're going to do that. We know that if we want something to be behind something else as an absolute, we need the parent to be relative. So let's set the members section to be relative so that we can add this new element below it. And I'm wondering whether I need to have some kind of a wrapper for this, or I can just add the text. Let me just try and add the text. I'm going to set this actually as an H2 because this is the heading of the section. So I'm adding a H2 element. Let me put this at the top. And let's call this members heading. Okay, and we want this members heading, which it's currently here above the element that we have here. It's actually right here. Members. What's the text? Members only. Okay, members only. Want to make it. Want to turn it into absolute positioning. So positioning absolute. Make sure that it's aligning to the top. All right. Let's see how it looks right now. So it's here. Very hard to see right now. Let's just give it a color temporarily while we're working on it. Okay, so how are we going to make sure that the text is exactly what we want it to take up the whole screen and changing if the screen is changing? The hint is that the fact that the screen is changing. So we might want to use viewport width as the size. So if the viewport width is becoming smaller, the text is becoming smaller as well. So let's go here into the text size. And instead of using pixels, let's use viewport width, and I'm just going to try 20 viewport width and see what that does. Whoa, that's huge. All right, let me make that smaller for a second. Let's also go ahead and make this uppercase, make this 700 on 75 so it's more condensed. Okay, that looks good. Maybe I'm thinking maybe we need to even condense the letter spacing a little bit. So letter spacing, -1, maybe even minus, I would do -5 here. Yeah, so it's tighter. Whenever you have like big typography, you want to make sure that spacing is tight. So now let's go ahead and increase the viewport width. Also probably the height here of the letter spacing. Do we have space at the top? A little bit of space, but not a lot. Actually, you know what? I actually like that it's touching. So for now, let's set it to touch. And know what happens if I'm moving into 22 viewport width, the line breaks. So in this case, we really don't want the line to break. So let's go here. You see we have breaking. Line, let's set this to no wrap. Okay, so now it's not breaking. Even if the size of the screen is, it wants to break a line, it will not break. So it will force it to be. That being said, it now gives us this tiny little bit of horizontal scroll because, it's getting out of the page. So to solve that, we'll go into the members section and just make sure that we don't have no overflow. So it acts as a mask. So now I don't have that. So that's good. I also think that I want the M to start exactly at the beginning. So maybe I'm going to have the members heading have a kind of like a negative margin from the left. So let me just pull this in a tiny bit so that it looks like the M is here. And I think the sizing is good. Let's see what would happen if we change. Okay, so you can see that now as we're changing the size of the screen, the text is resizing, which is good. It's because it's resizing, and I guess maybe it's also resizing the height, line height. Oh, maybe we want to set this as viewport width as well. Viewport width. Let's make this a little bit smaller. Also, I see that it's on top of this card element. So let's just make sure that this card element, member featured event, let's set this as relative. Oh, the whole thing is now, now the whole thing is on top. Okay, so maybe what we need to do is to put the members heading actually inside of this. Instead of making it absolute and relative to the members section, let's actually make it relative to this collection item. Let's give this a try. So let's put it inside. Let's turn this into relative. Let's bring this inside here. Okay, so now it's relative to this. We all don't need this. Yeah, we don't care that it's relative, but it's all right. So now the members heading, you can see here, is relative to its parent, which is the featured event, and we can set the white card to be relative so that it's on top. Okay, that's great. That's what I wanted. Now let's see if it's responsive. It is now responsive. Let's preview this, and I can go ahead and change that, and that looks good. So I can decide if I want the spacing at the top. Maybe I'll pull in the white heading, just remove the, yeah, exactly. Now it's aligned to the top, almost. Maybe I'll do a little bit of a negative margin just so that it's really on top of it. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. Okay, so that is great. One thing that we do want to do is use this blending mode, which is, let me see, I think I've played around with this earlier, and I think we need to have kind of like a gray color and a blend mode of exclusion, maybe? Yeah, I think it's exclusion. Now you want to play around with these blend modes to see what do you like more. And actually, to be fair, it's also worth checking with different events. So let's go to the event, to the collection list, and let's see if we would filter for a different event. For example, if this was based on date, most recent date, I want not filter, sorry, what I want is sort. So let's sort by date, newest. Okay, so now we have a different event. Okay, so it still looks good. I think we're going to keep it in this blend mode, exclusion, and the color of the text is kind of like a light gray. Can play around with this and see how it's reacting. Actually, you know what? If it's white, it's actually nicer. So let's keep it this way. I think it's pretty cool. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to create this kind of like parallax effect as I'm scrolling through this section. So let's go to this member section. Let's go to interaction and add while scrolling in view. I'm going to create a new animation, and let's call this member section scroll. Okay, let's make sure that we're selecting the element that we want to animate, which is the members heading. And let's first of all move it. So add a move, and when we're starting to scroll, when we're getting into the section, let's move it down. So I'm going to pull in on the Y to here, about here. And then when we're at 100, let's bring it back to 0. Let's preview that. Okay, so as we are scrolling, you can see that the member section is going up, 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 up. Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Maybe I brought it too down here. But overall, I think it's a pretty cool effect. Now, the next thing that I wanted to do is to animate the width or how bold the text is. So because this is a variable font, you can see that when I am selecting it and looking for a new parameter, we have font variation. And so let's go ahead and, first of all, duplicate this to 0 and 100. And when we're starting, let's go ahead and pick, not as the width, but as a weight, let's make it super, super light. Maybe that's too extreme. And make sure that it's still maybe like 75. Okay, so if we're making it very light, it's actually going to not fill up the whole screen. So let's change the width to something like this. Okay, so it's starting from weight of 100 and width of 86, and we know already how it finishes. It finishes with a weight of 700 and a width of 75. Okay, so it's going to condense and become bolder as we are scrolling. Let's test this out. And as we are scrolling, you can see it becomes bold, 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 bold. And maybe actually we want this to reach the final position, not because you can see that when we have the full section in view, we're actually only in the 50%. So let's move both of these up here into the 50% mark. So when the section is in full view, actually the animation finishes. So we're scrolling and you can see it becomes bolder, 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 and gets to its final position. Let's play this around just to see how it looks. Scrolling, 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 and becomes bolder, reaching its position as we have the section in full view. That was pretty cool, wasn't it? I'll see you in the next video.